April 29, 1945, Dachau, 1430. American soldiers of the 45th Infantry Division stand in the coal yard. 17 SS guards line up against a high brick wall. Their hands are raised. This is the international sign of surrender. Under the Geneva Convention, these men are now prisoners of war. They expect a march to a camp, a trial, or a cage. Instead, an American soldier raises his rifle. The first shot breaks the silence. Then, a dry rattle of synchronized fire drowns out the screams. 17 bodies hit the ground in a tangle of limbs and wool. They are dead before they stop twitching. Minutes later, 16 more guards face the same wall in another sector of the camp. What is 50 dead guards? It is the strength of 2 Wehrmacht infantry platoons. They were eliminated in minutes without a single battle order. Then, the soldiers turn their backs. They hand shovels and iron bars to the liberated prisoners. The Americans watch as inmates stomp on faces until skulls cave in. They say nothing as the victims are beaten to death with their own tools. By sunset, 50 SS guards are executed after surrendering. These were the liberators, the good guys. This is what happens when good men encounter absolute evil. 2 hours before the first shots rang out in the coal yard, the war felt over. The date was April 29, 1945. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler was preparing his suicide for the following day. The German front had disintegrated into a series of isolated pockets. Peace was no longer a hope, it was a mathematical certainty. The maps in Allied headquarters were covered in fresh ink. Every day brought news of another liberation. The Red Army had already cleared the death factories at Auschwitz, Majdanek, and Treblinka. 2 weeks prior, the British entered the nightmare of Bergen-Belsen. American units had already documented the horrors of Buchenwald and Ohrdruf. They had seen the mass graves, they had smelled the decay. But those camps were on the periphery. Dachau sat in the very heart of Bavaria, near Munich. The soldiers of the 45th Infantry Division were veterans. They expected another routine sweep of a collapsing Reich. They were wrong. The Americans were moving toward the gates of the very first concentration camp. While the Allies closed in on Munich, Commandant Martin Weiss had already abandoned his post. He didn't wait for the Americans. He fled on April 26th. Most senior SS officers followed him. They left behind a skeletal crew and 30,000 prisoners. Who was left to face the American army? 560 terrified recruits. Dachau was the blueprint. It opened on March 22, 1933. It was the first. Hitler had been chancellor for only a few weeks when the gates swung shut. It began with political enemies. It ended with a sprawling empire of 169 subcamps. 200,000 people passed through these gates. At least 41,500 never left. By late April, the main camp was a graveyard of the living. Prisoners wore striped rags. The fabric hung off their frames like covers over coat hangers. Typhus and dysentery did the work of the executioners. 200 people died every single day. The elite SS units were gone. The remaining guards were Hungarian Volksdeutsche. These were ethnic Germans drafted into service only weeks prior. They were inexperienced. They were panicked. On April 27th, they forced 7,000 prisoners out into the cold. It was a final death march toward the Alps. On the morning of April 28th, the SS forced 7,000 people onto the road to the Tyrolean Alps, 39 boxcars, 2,310 corpses. On the morning of April 29, 1945, the 45th Infantry Division moved toward Munich. They didn't have orders to stop at Dachau. It wasn't on the map. But then the wind changed. A heavy, sweet stench hit the column hundreds of meters before the tracks. It was the smell of rotting meat and old clothes. The soldiers reached a railway siding. A train from Buchenwald sat on the rails. For 7 days, these people had traveled without a drop of water or a crumb of bread. To put that in perspective, it was the entire population of a small American town, wiped out in a single train. What did the soldiers find inside? Most had died of starvation, others froze to death. The SS shot the rest. The first soldier reached a boxcar. He gripped the heavy wooden door and slid it back. It groaned on the metal rollers. Inside, a wall of gray skin and striped fabric. The bodies were stacked like cordwood. He stared for a second, then doubled over and retched into the dirt. Some corpses had wood splinters in their teeth. They had been trying to eat the floorboards to survive. Journalist Marguerite Higgins watched as the veterans of 2 years of combat broke down. These men had seen artillery shred squads and tanks crush infantry, but they couldn't stomach this. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks watched his battalion. His men were no longer looking for the enemy. They were looking at faces frozen in agony, ribs pushing through skin like cage bars. The shock was physical. It was a sensory overload that bypassed the brain and hit the gut. The soldiers of the 45th Division stood by the tracks in a daze. 2,310 bodies lay under the spring sun. The soldiers moved past the wagons and reached the iron gate. The words "Arbeit macht frei" hung over the entrance. Work sets you free. The camp was a ticking bomb. Victor Maurer, a representative of the Red Cross, tried to manage the surrender. He had negotiated with the remaining SS. 100 guards had stacked their arms. 50 more stayed in the towers to prevent a mass breakout. Maurer warned the Americans. 42,000 inmates were inside, half-crazed, infected with typhus, starving. The chaos started at the gate. Brigadier General Henning Linden of the 42nd Infantry Division arrived to accept the formal surrender. But the soldiers of the 45th were already inside. The sound hit them first. A low, rhythmic roar. A wall of voices like a stadium crowd, but vibrating from the throats of living skeletons. Then came the surge. Thousands of prisoners rushed forward. They grabbed the GIs. They hoisted them onto their shoulders. They smothered them in embraces. It was a delirium of survival. Suddenly, flags appeared above the crowd, hidden for years, secretly sewn in the dark of the barracks. Polish, Russian, and American colors waved over the mass of striped uniforms. The Americans did not join the celebration. They stood in a frozen stupor. The smell of human waste and rotting flesh was a physical weight. They saw barracks packed beyond capacity. They saw bodies piled in corners like cordwood. It was April 29th, a warm Sunday. Under the spring sun, 10,000 corpses were decomposing in the open. 4 Germans raised their hands to surrender. Lieutenant William Walsh raised his pistol to kill. Walsh had survived years of combat, but the train cars at the back entrance of the camp broke him. He stood before a mountain of corpses, then looked at the 4 men in uniform. The law of war evaporated. Walsh fired. He shot all 4 dead in the dirt. Private Albert Pruitt climbed into the boxcar to finish the job. He walked among the wounded, a single shot to each head. The execution had begun. Was this an isolated outburst? No. The frenzy spread toward Tower B. Only minutes earlier, SS guards had used this position to fire on the approaching 45th Division. Now, 17 Germans stood against a wall. They were no longer combatants. They were targets. A machine gun opened up. 17 men collapsed in a heap of wool and blood. In a nearby coal yard, another 16 were lined up. Another volley. Another 16 bodies. The sound of the massacre reached Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks. He ran toward the coal yard as the air filled with the scent of spent powder and iron. Sparks saw his men turning into executioners. He didn't just shout, he acted. Sparks fired his own pistol into the air and threw his body between the muzzles and the prisoners. He physically kicked his own soldiers away from their machine guns. Walsh had started the fire, but Sparks tried to douse it before the entire battalion lost its soul. He ordered an immediate ceasefire and demanded the medics treat the surviving Germans. Sparks managed to stop the clock, but 33 SS guards were already dead. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks physically kicked the soldiers away from their weapons. The mass execution at Dachau did not happen in a vacuum. 5 months before the liberators reached the camp gates, an event in the Belgian snow changed the rules of engagement forever. 18 December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge. Near the town of Malmedy, an SS unit under Joachim Peiper cornered a group of Americans. These were not frontline infantry. They were soldiers from Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. Simple spotters. rear echelon troops. After a brief skirmish, 113 men surrendered. The scene was calm. G is stood in a snow-covered field, hands rested on helmets. Some shared cigarettes. They joked about the end of the war. They thought the fighting was over. Then the tone shifted. Major Werner Puchki leaned toward a sergeant. He gave a quiet order. "You know what to do with them." The laughter died. Machine guns opened fire. The first volley mowed down the center of the crowd. Bodies slumped into the slush. SS troops moved through the piles of khaki. They looked for movement. They delivered single shots to the head of anyone still breathing. 84 Americans died in that field. That is nearly half the strength of a standard infantry company wiped out in minutes. News of the Malmedy Massacre spread through the ranks like wildfire. By the time the 45th Infantry Division reached Dachau, they had seen 500 days of continuous combat. They had lost 75% of their original brothers in arms. To these men, the SS were no longer enemy combatants, they were targets. Execution of SS prisoners became an unwritten rule, a routine, a culture of vengeance that followed the American units deep into the heart of Germany. The stories from Malmedy didn't just stay in the snowy fields of Belgium. They traveled. They moved through the ranks like a virus, fueled by the headlines of Stars and Stripes and the haunting photos in Life magazine. By late December, the American mood had shifted from exhaustion to a cold, calculated rage. The informal rule became a standard. Do not take SS prisoners, just shoot them. How deep did this hatred go? The 328th Infantry Regiment turned this whisper into a printed reality. Their orders were explicit. No SS troops and no paratroopers were to be taken alive. They were to be shot on sight. The mechanics of revenge became official policy. At Chinon, on January 1, 1945, the 11th Armored Division proved it. They lined up approximately 80 captured SS men. Then they opened fire with machine guns. Sergeant John Faig watched as his comrades marched more prisoners up a hill to join the pile of the dead. He hated the business, but the business was thriving. It wasn't just one unit or one rogue officer. The 90th Infantry Division was executing Waffen-SS prisoners so systematically that headquarters finally stepped in. The top brass had to issue express orders to stop the killings. The orders changed nothing. By the time the Americans reached the gates of Dachau in April, the habit of killing was already months old. They arrived at the camp with a refined, routine practice of execution. Then they saw the train with 2,310 corpses. 2,310 corpses. This number hit the soldiers of the 45th Division before they even reached the camp gates. The death train sat on the siding. Open the sliding door. Bodies spill out like logs. Move to the next car. More skeletons in striped rags. One glance at the train was a psychological meat grinder. The total count reached 30,000 starving prisoners and 10,000 rotting bodies scattered across the grounds. How did the guards look? The American infantrymen turned their heads. Standing near the piles of bone and ash were the SS guards. They were well fed. Their cheeks were ruddy. Their uniforms were pressed and clean. Contrast. The stench of gangrene and excrement against the smell of polished leather. The living dead against the masters of the camp. Felix Sparks saw his men's faces change. The routine of war vanished. It was replaced by a cold, white-hot rage. The math of the horror was simple and brutal. 2,310 dead in those cars alone. That is more than the total American lives lost on Omaha Beach during the entire D-Day landing. Sparks later faced the inevitable question: should they have taken them prisoner? He spoke of the smell. He spoke of the sight of the absolute depravity. He knew the Geneva Convention by heart. He knew that shooting surrendered prisoners of war is a crime. No exceptions. But at that moment, the law didn't exist. There was only the train and the men who had filled it. Understanding the anger does not justify the bullets. The executions were a clear violation of the Geneva Convention. While Sparks grappled with the horror of the death train, the liberated inmates took their own justice. The power dynamic flipped in seconds. Victims became executioners. Some prisoners swarmed the fences to carry American soldiers on their shoulders. Others hunted. Who exactly pulled the triggers? In the chaos, the hands of infantrymen and inmates blurred together. Some soldiers simply handed their weapons to the prisoners. Those without guns used shovels or bare hands. Soldiers from the 2002nd Infantry Regiment stood by. They heard the rhythmic, wet thud of shovels hitting bone. They didn't stop it. One witness saw an inmate stomping a guard's face into the dirt until it was unrecognizable. Walenti Lauritz testified that prisoners knocked SS men down and disappeared them under a wave of boots. Near the camp moat, Sergeant Daryl Martin watched as guards were shot where they stood and kicked into the water. 3 young Jewish men later confessed to a chaplain that they found a sadistic guard hiding in a barn. He was dressed as a peasant. They beat him to death on the spot. By the end of the day, inmates had killed between 25 and 50 guards. Total deaths, including those executed by American rifles, climbed much higher. 60 to 100 dead. The exact number vanished in the euphoria and the rage. American soldiers watched as the liberated inmates tore their captors apart. The bodies in the coal yard were still cold when the first statements were taken on May 3rd. The carnage of Liberation Day was over. Now the bureaucracy of war took over. Was this a secret? Assistant Inspector General Joseph Whitaker didn't think so. He began his investigation just 4 days after the massacre. He collected photographs. He tracked down witnesses. He built a paper trail of blood. Whitaker finished his work on June 8, 1945. It was exactly 1 month after Germany's final surrender. The IG report was a surgical strike against the narrative of a clean liberation. It documented the execution of 21 SS guards who had already surrendered. The details were clinical. Lieutenant William Walsh had gunned down 4 Germans inside a boxcar. Private Albert Pruitt moved through the yard to deliver the coup de grace to the wounded. Whitaker proved that the violence wasn't just a stray bullet or a heat-of-the-moment reflex. It was systematic. Soldiers from the tower and the coal yard had participated in organized executions. The American military machine turned on its own. General George S. Patton watched as legal authorities drew up court-martial charges against Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks and his officers. The heavy folder of charges landed on the desk of General George S. Patton. By late 1945, Patton held absolute power as the military governor of Bavaria. He didn't just review the case, he ended it. Every charge against Sparks and his men vanished. No courts-martial, no prison time, no public trials. How does a general justify a massacre? Colonel Charles L. Decker provided the answer in his final report. He admitted the law was broken. The letters of international treaties were clear. American soldiers had shot prisoners without a trial. But Decker pointed to the sensory horror of the coal yard. The sights and smells of Dachau had changed the rules of engagement. He argued that under such conditions, fixing individual blame was impossible. Patton agreed. He chose the raw emotion of his soldiers over the cold text of the law. The military decided that the crimes of the SS justified the rage of the Americans. Justice was no longer about the book. It was about the ground. The files were closed and the soldiers went home. By the end of the year, George S. Patton had dismissed every single charge against the men of the 45th Division. Patton burned the evidence. He buried the files on the executions. But the American military was already facing a psychological collapse. The source of this rage appeared 2 weeks earlier, April 4, 1945. The 4th Armored Division reaches Ohrdruf. It is the first concentration camp liberated by Americans. General Dwight D. Eisenhower arrives on April 12th. He walks through the gates. He sees the torture racks. He sees the piles of skeletal corpses. The smell of the crematorium clings to his uniform. Eisenhower is usually a man of cold logic. Not today. He stands before the bodies and speaks to his staff. He says that the American soldier is often told he doesn't know what he is fighting for. Now, Eisenhower says, at least we know what he is fighting against. He issues a sudden, unprecedented order. Every American soldier nearby must see the camp. Thousands of GIs are marched past the mass graves. Eisenhower wants them to see. He wants them to remember. The general understands the risk. He knows that seeing this evil will break something inside his men. He knows that once they see what the SS did, they will stop taking prisoners. He realizes that revenge is no longer a possibility. It is an inevitability. The soldiers at Dachau did not become monsters overnight. They were men pushed past the limits of human processing. They encountered a scale of industrial murder that destroyed their moral compass. They responded with the only language left. The United States Army saw the blood on their hands. Then they looked at the piles of bodies in the camp. They chose to look away. Execution was the final, brutal act of a war that had already abandoned all rules. General Eisenhower's official report stated the atrocities at Ohrdruf were beyond the American mind's ability to comprehend. American troops walked into Dachau, expecting to find the architects of the Holocaust. They found teenagers instead. The veterans of the Totenkopfverbände had managed the camp since 1933. They knew the end was coming. Days before liberation, the senior SS staff vanished. They left behind ghosts and a few hundred conscripts. Most were Hungarian Volksdeutsche. These were ethnic Germans from outside the Reich. Many had worn the black uniform for less than a month. Were they killers? A private looks at a guard. He sees the silver runes on the collar. The wool is black and clean against the spring mud. To the American, this man is the Einsatzgruppen. He is the ghost of the 1.5 million people murdered in Eastern Europe. He is the administrator of the final solution. In reality, this 18-year-old had never seen Auschwitz. He had never pulled a trigger at a mass grave. He was simply assigned to a guard tower while the real executioners fled. The American soldiers didn't ask for papers. They didn't check service records. They had seen the massacres at Malmedy. They knew the SS never took prisoners. For the Americans, the uniform was the crime. They saw the skull on the cap and saw a system that had killed 41,500 people in this camp alone. The conscripts stood in the mud. They raised their hands. They spoke Hungarian and broken German. The Americans didn't listen. They didn't see the boys. They only saw the runes. The soldiers did not see any difference. The Hungarian conscripts saw an execution. The men pulling the triggers saw something else. In that moment, the word crime lost its meaning. One body, three perspectives. The American soldier looks through the sights. He sees the enemy. The black uniform is a target. He does not see a prisoner. He sees the stench of the cattle cars and the stacks of skeletal remains. He fires. The prisoner watches from behind the wire. He sees a miracle. For 12 years, these guards were gods of death. They starved, beat, and murdered with absolute whim. Now, the gods are bleeding in the dirt. To the 32,000 survivors of Dachau, this was the first act of justice since 1933. The lawyer stands apart. He sees a violation of the Geneva Convention. Article 2 of the 1929 treaty is clear. Prisoners of war must be protected from acts of violence. The guards had surrendered. They had laid down their weapons. Legally, this was murder. Is it possible to judge a man who has just walked through the gates of hell? The United States Army answered with a firm no. Commanders faced a brutal choice. They had reports of the massacre. They had the names of the soldiers, but they also had the photographs of the liberated camp. Senior American officers weighed the law against the psychological duress of their men. They saw a psyche broken by the sight of 10,000 corpses. The military investigators completed their report. The evidence of a war crime was absolute, yet the high command stepped in. They chose to ignore the findings. They refused to court-martial a single soldier for the killings at the coal yard. General George Patton personally took the investigation files and swept them into a wastebasket. The military faced a choice: punish the soldiers for the executions or accept the slaughter as a consequence of war. They chose the latter. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, shooting prisoners is a war crime. No exceptions, no excuses. Yet the American command looked at the evidence and looked away. 10,000 rotting bodies filled the camp. 2,310 corpses lay in boxcars outside the gates. The soldiers had spent years in combat, but this was different. This was a systematic breaking of the human mind. The army decided that expecting perfect discipline in the center of hell was unrealistic. They chose mercy for the liberators over justice for the dead. The decision created a legal precedent that remains a battlefield of ethics. If American troops can kill without consequence, the line between the victor and the villain thins. International law exists to stop revenge. It exists to keep the soldier human when everything around him is subhuman. Ignoring the massacre undermined the entire global legal framework. The debate persists, but the physical reality was simpler. Most of the SS guards killed at the coal yard had only arrived at the camp days or even hours before the liberation. Justification was the goal, but silence became the weapon. The military didn't just excuse the killings, they erased them. The army launched an investigation. General Howard Whitaker compiled the evidence, testimonies, photographs of the coal yard, ballistic reports. Then, the file vanished. For decades, the official history of Dachau remained clean, heroic, and undisputed. Why did the truth stay hidden? The Whitaker report lay in the National Archives, marked with the highest level of secrecy. It survived the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall. The public saw nothing for 46 years. The seal finally broke in 1991. Only after the unification of Germany did the Pentagon declassify the documents. Historians found what the generals already knew in 1945. American soldiers committed war crimes. They executed prisoners of war in cold blood. The U.S. Army chose a path of tactical amnesia. No trials, no convictions, just 46. When the truth finally surfaced in 1991, historians placed two numbers on the scales. On one side, the rage of a single afternoon. On the other, a decade of industrial slaughter. 35 to 50. That is the estimated number of SS guards killed by Americans in the heat of the liberation. Now look at the other side of the balance. 41,500 people died inside the wire of Dachau alone. 6 million Jews perished across the continent. Visual: a mountain of victims' shoes against a handful of brass casings. One was a breakdown of discipline, a spontaneous outburst, an isolated failure of command. The other was a system. It was premeditated, organized, and sustained for years. The scale and the intent exist in different universes. The Americans committed a crime, but the SS operated a factory of death. The investigators weighed the guilt and chose silence. In the eyes of the military commission, 41,500 outweighed 50. April 29, 1945, the day the liberators became executioners. This single date forced the American military to make a choice. They looked at the bodies of the guards and then at the surviving prisoners. 41,500 people had died in that camp. This weight of death crushed the scales of military law. The gravel crunches under boots at the Dachau Memorial today. Tourists walk past the same walls where the guards stood. A black and white photo shows them falling. The modern air is silent, but the site still holds the echo of the Garand rifles. The army launched an investigation immediately. They found the bodies. They interviewed the shooters. These numbers don't justify the killings. They explain why the system chose to look away. Every participant kept their rank. Not one soldier lost his pension. The military commission decided that punishing men who had seen such depravity was against justice. It was a cold, calculated mercy for their own. Liberation had a brutal face. History isn't a story of heroes in white gloves. It is the record of what happened when good men met absolute evil. The truth remained hidden in files for decades. American soldiers executed captured SS guards at Dachau.